On 9 July 2014, the Firearm Blog reported an incident which occurred in August 2011 in Norway's Svalbard Islands, in which a polar bear attacked a group of students, killing one. That death might have been prevented if the group leader knew how to properly operate the Mauser rifle the party had taken along for defense. This video will demonstrate the basic operation of the Mauser bolt-action rifles, particularly the model of 1898 and its many copies and derivatives. These instructions should also apply to many earlier Mauser models, and in broader terms to many modern sporting bolt-action rifles. The Mausers were among the first bolt-action repeating rifles, dating back to the 1884 tube magazine refit of the 1871 single-shot. The modern Mauser bolt-action approached its current form with the Spanish models of 1893 and Swedish versions of 1894. The 1898 pattern is the definitive Mauser, and one of the most influential designs in firearm history. Just as John Browning's pistol of 1911 influenced over a century of handgun development, the 98 Mauser is the direct or indirect ancestor of nearly every bolt-action rifle which followed it. I have here two examples of the 98 Mauser. First, a VZ-24 from Czechoslovakia, their model of 1924. This is cosmetically similar and functionally identical to the German K98K of 1935. Most of this rifle's parts are interchangeable with the original German. It is also chambered for the same cartridge, the original 7.92 by 57mm or 8mm Mauser. Second, a commercially built post-war Mauser, probably of Spanish origin, in sporting configuration and chambered for the .308 Winchester cartridge. These two rifles, made for different cartridges in different countries, decades apart, are functionally almost identical, and many of their parts are interchangeable. Let's begin by identifying the major features and controls. Many Mauser rifles will have been sporterized from a military configuration, and their operation may be slightly different. The receiver, which holds all other parts together. Military versions will often have a national crest or production code on top, a charger guide at the rear, and a cutout on the left side of the receiver for use with that charger guide. This sporting version has no such cutout, nor does it have a charger guide. The tops of the receiver are smooth and have been drilled and tapped for scope-based mounting. So many Mauser rifles of so many kinds have been imported over the last 100 and more years that the dimensions for these scope bases have long since been standardized, and many sporting goods stores will keep them in stock. The trigger. Both these rifles have had aftermarket improved triggers installed. The magazine. Most Mausers will have a 5-round staggered column magazine. Military versions will have a removable floor plate, though this is rarely opened in practice. Sporting versions will often have a hinged or otherwise easily opened floor plate, or may have removable magazines. This particular one is using a military-style magazine box. This rifle came with a different stock and a 3-round blind magazine which could not be opened from the bottom. When I replaced the stock, I was required to add this military-style magazine box. The bolt. Some, but not all, military versions had a straight bolt handle like this VZ-24. Some of the German military models had the bolt handle turned down. Most sporting models will have the bolt handle turned down and swept back to various degrees. The cocking piece. Inside, the bolt shroud. Military versions usually require the firing pin to be cocked before the safety can be engaged. This may not be true of all sporting versions. The cocking piece gives a visual indicator as to the state of the weapon. The safety lever. Military versions usually have a 3-position safety. Left is fire. The middle position is safe, while still allowing loading and unloading, while the right position also locks the bolt while preventing firing. This is supposedly where the student group leader in Norway failed to correctly operate the weapon. I'll go into this in more detail at the end of the video. This sporting version came with a side safety, and when I replaced the trigger with an aftermarket improvement, I chose a model with a side safety. On this particular rifle, forward is fire and back is safe. Both positions allow loading and unloading. Some sporting conversions of military rifles use a two-position safety in the original bolt shroud, replacing the original military three-position lever and omitting the third locked position. These two-position safeties are often low profile to allow mounting a telescopic sight. Replacement bolt shrouds are also available, changing the direction of the safety lever movement from left and right to fore and aft, swinging perpendicular to the bolt. The loading and ejection port. Military versions can usually be loaded with stripper clips through this guide on the top of the receiver. Sporting versions usually do not have this feature. Some sporting versions will have detachable magazines, allowing fast reloading from the bottom. The buttstock. Military versions will often have implements embedded to aid in disassembly of the bolt. This will be illustrated later in this video. The most common set of dimensions are the large ring 98 Mauser, which both of these are. These dimensions are an international standard generations old, and many suppliers offer aftermarket stocks for this dimension. The rear sight and front sight. Military version sights will differ depending on their origin and vintage, and will be calibrated to the military ammunition being issued by that nation's government. This VZ-24 has been refit with aftermarket sights. Sporting versions often have no metallic sights at all, intended for use only with optical sights. This sporting version has very simple metallic sights to be used as backup in case the scope fails. When purchased, this rifle came with a higher quality metallic sight mounted on the rear of the receiver, similar to this photo of a target rifle. This sight was removed for scope mounting. The barrel. So many Mausers of so many kinds have been imported over 100 and more years that an entire sub-industry exists providing barrels for customizing these rifles. Again, the most common dimension is the large ring 98, which both of these are. Military versions will often have barrel bands, nose caps, bayonet lugs, and the like, which will vary depending on origin and vintage. Books have been written on the many variations of the German rifles alone. Now let's see how to unload and make safe a weapon of this type. For the military VZ-24, these are dummy rounds I made, with pulled components donated by my transcontinental blog brother from C. Emily Play. Holes have been drilled in the cases, and the Berdan primers have been fired. For the sporting version, these are A-Zoom snap caps, solid aluminum inert dummy rounds. They're expensive, typically $10 for a pair of rifle rounds, but they're perfect for most forms of dry practice and function testing. They are advertised as being available for over 100 cartridges. Cartridges may be removed by pressing this button and opening the magazine floor plate, but military-style floor plates are difficult to open unless they have been altered. If you have a sporting model with a hinged floor plate or an improved latch, by all means use it first to remove rounds from the magazine without cycling them through the action. Likewise, if your rifle has a detachable magazine, remove it first. Always keeping the weapon pointed in a safe direction and your fingers away from the trigger, first examine the weapon without changing any of the controls. You can see the cocking piece is extended, meaning both these rifles are presently cocked. If the weapon is not cocked, it is highly unlikely there will be a live round in the chamber. Next, examine the position of the safety. Sporting versions will often allow the bolt to be opened with the safety engaged. If the safety is not engaged, by all means, engage it. Military versions typically have three positions on the safety. Left is fire, Middle is the load and unload safe position, and right is the full safe position, which also locks the bolt. With the safety engaged in a loading or unloading position, lift the bolt handle 90 degrees and pull the bolt rearward. This will extract and eject any cartridge which may be in the chamber. If additional rounds are in the magazine, closing the bolt will chamber the next round. Most owner's manuals instruct the owner to do exactly that in order to cycle the rounds through and empty the magazine. However, this greatly increases the risk of negligent discharge. It also risks damage to soft point hunting bullets, especially if you're using a sporting rifle, which can affect accuracy if you're cycling the same cartridges through the action over and over again. It also risks setting the bullet back in the case, potentially compressing powder and leading to high firing pressures. Instead of chambering each round all the way, here's a method I've discovered. Push the bolt forward just enough to pop the cartridge out of its feed lips, then tilt the rifle until the cartridge falls out. And repeat that until all cartridges have been removed. The same is true for the sporting rifle. Taking care to not close and lock the bolt on a live round. This particular sporting rifle is using the .308 Winchester cartridge, although it's the same length of action originally designed for the much longer 7.92mm military cartridge. In such a case, you're going to have some dimensional differences which may complicate feeding. If you're feeding live rounds positively, moving the bolt firmly and briskly as it's supposed to be, you won't have any feeding problems. If you're trying to delicately unload the weapon in this manner, you might have to jiggle and reach in and pluck the cartridge out. Once all ammunition has been removed from the weapon, verifying visually and by touch that no ammunition remains in the chamber or in the magazine, insert an open bolt indicator for range safety. To close the weapon for storage, run the bolt forward, turn it down 90 degrees, and if you feel like it, pointing in a safe direction, after triple and quadruple checking that all ammunition has been removed, you can release the firing pin spring. There are different philosophies as to whether this is necessary and whether it will wear out the firing pin spring. Since the .98 Mauser particularly is one of the most common bolt actions in the world, replacement springs and replacement pins and replacement parts of all kinds are easily available. When closing the bolt on an empty magazine, some magazine followers have a square rear end which will block the bolt from forward motion when the magazine is empty. Neither of these two rifles do, but I've encountered others that do. This is to indicate to a soldier in the heat of battle that his weapon is empty, because he can't close the bolt. Some have the follower ground at an angle at that point so the bolt rides over it, as both of these do. Others have simply had the followers replaced. So that is another feature to look out for, depending on which rifle you have. Now let's see how to load and fire a weapon of this type. Again, these are dummy rounds, some of which I made, and others I purchased. The Mausers from 1893 onward were among, if not the first, to use a staggered column magazine, increasing capacity without increasing height. To load loose cartridges, each is rolled into the magazine, naturally going to alternate sides. The same is true of sporting versions, you just have to reach under the scope. Military versions may be loaded much faster with chargers or stripper clips. The charger is preloaded with cartridges. Military ammunition is usually issued to soldiers this way, and it often still is for quickly loading magazines for modern automatic rifles. The charger is placed in its guide For the 98 Mauser, the charger is double-ended. It can go in either way. Cartridges are then pushed in with the thumb. They automatically go to alternate sides of the staggered column. That's what this cutout here is for, although when I'm shooting in a match, I usually use the right thumb to press the cartridges down because my left arm is wrapped around a sling as a shooting aid. The empty charger can then be removed by hand, but in the 98 Mauser, and some similar designs, a brisk strike on the bolt handle will pop the charger out of its guide, and following through will chamber the first round. There are many kinds of chargers from many different nations who used rifles of a comparable type. They are not interchangeable. Each nation had different dimensions for their different rifles and their different cartridges. The 98 Mauser and its family of closely related cartridges remains the most common. They're usually determined by these three bumps on the side. Quality steel chargers like this can be reused dozens of times before they wear out. There are other types of chargers. Some are very cheap, stamped out of a single piece of brass. Those probably won't last as long. When you're in a gun store or gun show buying stripper clips, you have to examine them carefully to make sure you're getting the right clip for your rifle and the ammunition you're using. Sometimes you can find bulk surplus ammunition on the internet which comes packaged on these clips, and some people are selling just this clip for $1 or more a piece. If, after fully loading the magazine, you don't want to chamber the first round, on some rifles you may be able to push down and run the bolt over the top cartridge, closing the bolt on an empty chamber. This makes for safer carry in the field. If the first round has not been chambered, you must operate the bolt fully, firmly, and briskly to successfully chamber the first round. Remember, the military models have a 3-position safety. All the way to the right, locks the bolt and disconnects the trigger. The middle position will allow loading and unloading, but still disconnects the trigger. If you're holding the weapon in the field, you can, with a right-handed grip, you can snap the safety off to the left, and now you're ready to fire. To fire, as usual, aim, ensure the manual safety is released, and press the trigger in the usual way. To fire the next shot, the bolt must be operated manually each time. Firmly, fully, and briskly. Do not be too gentle when working a bolt action. This will cause feeding problems. At this point, I'll splice in some video from a match I recently attended showing rapid fire and rapid reloading with stripper clips with this very rifle.
Ready? Now, ran the right, ran the left, ran the firing line. Target!
The operation is the same for the sporting type. After loading the desired number of cartridges, you can press down on the top and ride the bolt over. Depending on your particular rifle, what country it was made in, what generation made it, you may or may not be able to fully load the magazine and close the bolt on an empty chamber. Some rifles will hold all 5 rounds, another only 4. If the first round has not already been chambered, you must work the bolt fully, briskly, and firmly to chamber the first round. Safeties will vary considerably on the sporting models. Some are side safeties, which are simply fore and aft like this. Others have modified versions of the military safety. Others have replacement bolt shrouds with a safety that swings fore and aft in an arc on the bolt shroud. Again, to fire, aim, release the manual safety, and press the trigger in the usual way. And again, for the sporting model, the bolt must be fully, briskly, and firmly operated for each shot. In both the sporting and military versions, reloading is exactly the same as initial loading. Rather than making a separate video for disassembly, I will now illustrate how the bolt is removed and disassembled for maintenance. These instructions apply to the military versions with a 3-position safety. Sporting versions, depending on how different they are, may require different techniques. In either case, I reject liability if you cannot get your bolt back together. Emulate at your own risk. After clearing the weapon, make sure the firing pin is cocked and the safety is in the middle position. Be careful to not let the safety slip or be pushed out of this position during disassembly. The bolt is removed by pulling on this large latch at the left rear of the receiver. This has the added advantage of allowing the bore to be cleaned from the breech, thus reducing the risk of damage to the muzzle, which can degrade accuracy. You will find this same latch on the sporting versions of the 98 and on several modern civilian rifles like the Ruger Model 77. Also on the Japanese Arisaka military rifles, which are direct derivatives of the Mauser. Also the British Pattern 1914 and the American Model 1917 Enfield rifles. In case of a damaged firing pin or spring, the bolt itself can also be disassembled. Again, you must have the safety in the middle position, and you must not allow it to move out of that position during disassembly or reassembly. It would be very difficult to reassemble the bolt if the safety is not in the middle position. Special tools are available, but they're expensive and they're not supposed to be required because this is originally a military weapon meant for troops in the field. Military versions will usually have a piece of hardware in the stock, more often back here on the buttstock. This Czech version has this little dish in the middle. The German versions have one that passes all the way through the side of the buttstock. With the safety in the middle position and the firing pin cocked, press on this plunger to unscrew the bolt shroud and firing pin from the bolt body. The large claw extractor, distinctive to the 98 Mauser and several other designs, can also be removed by prying slightly up and sliding forward, but I'm not going to do that because it's difficult to get back on, and it's probably not going to fail. This one's 70 or 80 years old. To remove the firing pin from the bolt shroud, insert the firing pin into the disassembly hardware. On the German ones it would go all the way through. On this Czech we're just using this dish here so it doesn't slip out and stab you in the femoral artery. Pull down and rotate the cocking piece 90 degrees. Maintain control of that very powerful spring at all times, or it will fly across the room and possibly put your eye out. Now you can replace the firing pin if it's damaged, or if you want an aftermarket replacement like a titanium high-speed pin. You can change the spring. You can access the cocking piece if you want to give it to a gunsmith for fine-tuning. Here is the bolt shroud, and notice the safety is flopped over. You can remove the safety also and replace it with a 2-position sporting aftermarket replacement, which would go something like this. With a very short throw, one would be safe and the other would be fire, and it would allow clearance for a scope mount. Disassembly past this point is not recommended, and even this level is rarely necessary. Reassembly is the obvious reverse. Insert the safety into the bolt shroud. Make sure it's in the middle position. That is very important. Insert the firing pin into the bolt shroud. Notice how the firing pin has flat sides, and there is a corresponding cutout in the bolt shroud. Obviously, you have to put the spring onto the firing pin before putting that into the bolt shroud. I knew that. Insert the firing pin in the stock hardware. Triple and quadruple check that the safety is in the middle position. Get your hand something like this and get the cocking piece in position. Control that powerful spring at all times. Slide the cocking piece on, rotate it 90 degrees, and it's reassembled. The bolt shroud and firing pin assembly is then slipped back into the bolt body and threaded back in place. Note how this plunger skips over the bolt handle to its final position. The bolt is then reinserted, and the bolt latch will automatically spring over. Then perform a function test, including all 3 positions of the safety. Remember, on military models, the safety cannot be engaged unless the firing pin is cocked. Now, let's revisit that news article I mentioned at the beginning of the video. The rifle in the news article, which was very possibly wrong, as media usually is about firearms, was described very specifically as a Mauser K98K, the standard German infantry rifle of the Second World War. It's completely plausible to find such a rifle in Norway, which was occupied by the National Socialists until the end of the war. This VZ-24 is cosmetically very similar and functionally identical to the K98K. Let's presume the student group leader was carrying the rifle in this condition. 4 rounds in the magazine, a 5th round in the firing chamber, bolt closed, safety in the middle position. This is what I think happened. On military versions with a 3-position safety, presuming it was unaltered, the center position prevents firing while allowing the rifle to be loaded and unloaded, or the bolt to be cycled. As you can see, that vertical safety lever obscures the rifle's sights. So when you try to aim, you will immediately notice this great big safety lever sticking up in your line of sight. I can only presume the student group leader had no practical experience and very minimal training with any firearm, and never actually tried to aim the rifle at the polar bear that was eating one of his students. If he had, he would have immediately seen that safety lever blocking the sights, which he obviously didn't know how to use, and he would have known to push the safety into a fire position. But that's not what happened. The gist I got from the article was he would point the rifle at the bear, pull the trigger, nothing would happen. He would work the bolt, pull the trigger, nothing would happen, and he would repeat that again until all the live unfired cartridges had been ejected from the weapon, and he was standing there with an empty weapon, cartridges on the ground, in the snow and the mud, on the Svalbard Islands up in the Arctic Circle, and there's the bear eating his student. Now, it's possible the rifle in question may have been altered, with a different kind of safety, as I've explained. And it's also possible the news article completely misidentified the rifle and misreported the details of the incident, because media is usually blatantly biased and grossly incompetent where firearms are involved. Regardless, whatever weapon he had, there is no excuse for anyone who is responsible for the safety of others to be incompetent in the operation of the tools provided to ensure that safety. The primary purpose of this series of basic firearms tutorial videos is to remedy that ignorance and incompetence. This should conclude the basic operation and disassembly of the Model 1898 pattern Mauser bolt-action rifles and their many versions, descendants, and derivatives. Many of these instructions will also apply to modern sporting rifles not directly descended from the Mauser. If your rifle is different, consult your owner's manual, which should be available for free download from the manufacturer's website or elsewhere on the internet. The 98 Mauser and its many descendants are among the most common sporting rifles, and they may plausibly be encountered anywhere in the world. Everyone should know how to use one in case of emergency, like a polar bear eating a student you're responsible for. That is the purpose of this video and this series of basic firearms tutorial videos. If you have any questions, please leave them in comments, and if you found this video useful, please consider a charitable donation through my website's PayPal button. Thank you.